Welcome to the Dharma Doctor podcast. I'm Katie, and I'm here today with Brad Mosel, and we have a special guest, James Beauchemin. He is a professor of social work at Boise State University, and we are going to kind of talk through EMDR and bilateral stimulation and your whole journey. So thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
We're excited that you're here. So Brad and James have known each other for a little bit, and we wanted to kind of just get more about how you were introduced to all of this. We're trying to talk to different clinicians who are working with bilateral stimulation, and not specifically EMDR, but also would love to kind of hear you talk through how you define that. And so, yeah, tell us a little bit about your history.
Sure. So I'm an associate professor, at Boise State. So that means I teach a lot, primarily clinical classes, theoretical orientation, intervention classes, and do a lot of research. And that's sort of how Brad and I connected is looking at some research, intervention research specific to the bilateral stimulation. It's funny because I moved here basically after I got my doctorate. I got on the job market and landed in Boise and threw myself into, academia.
Okay.
So I'm going to be the best researcher. I'm going to be the best teacher. And the big thing that was missing, after a year of doing that, I was like, wow, this isn't really why I got into social work. And I really missed doing the clinical work. So I started a private practice, a small private part-time.
Here in Boise?
Here in Boise
okay.
to, that's the stuff that kind of fills me up, doing that work.
How long had you been in clinical work prior to going back into academia? What were your early days like? Before we jump back into that journey.
Yeah, I got my MSW at the University of Vermont, and immediately about almost 20 years ago now, jumped into clinical work, and I knew that that's what I wanted to do. Prior to that, I was a health and PE teacher for about 10 years. And
hey, that works really well with bilateral stimulation.
For sure.
Right?
Right. And that's really where the holistic well-being and the interest in mind, body, for me started. I was working at a school out in the Bay Area, again, teaching PE, but the school was specific to children and adolescents who had emotional behavioral disorders.
Okay. How old were you talking about? Like
K through 12.
K through 12. Okay.
Yep. And it was amazing to me how resilient these kids were because they had been through all of these traumatic experiences, things that, the three of us as adults don't have the tools to cope with.
Yeah.
And here's a 7-year-old who's been through this horrific experience. And of course it's manifesting in different ways and different challenges. So that sort of, piqued my interest as far as like, okay, how do I really, I can roll the ball out for PE and create a safe environment for them, but how do I therapeutically reach them and help them heal from that? And that led me to, all right, well, why am I not doing that work full time?
Okay.
So then I went back and got an MSW and started practicing. And then, immediately kind of moved into a school social work role, which was a nice, easy transition since I'd been in public schools. And it was there, I actually, as part of my contract, got the administrators to agree I wanted to be a trauma therapist.
Okay.
So they agreed to fund some training. So I got trained in prolonged exposure and cognitive processing in EMDR, which 20 years ago, people were like, what is this voodoo? Are you hypnotizing me? It wasn't mainstream like it is now. So I initially got trained in EMDR. I want to say it was 2006, 5 or 6 maybe.
And at that time, EMDR was almost always just specifically with trauma.
Yes.
Right? It was always
definitely.
associated with trauma.
Yep. And it was a new modality, and I don't know, when it officially became an evidence-based approach. But I don't think at that time, it was
And you were using EMDR with students at the school?
I was using it with students. I, again, was doing some private practice on the side, seeing individuals. But that's really where, I always had an interest in trauma and healing, helping our brains heal. And I've been using EMDR pretty consistently since then.
How would you, what is your definition of EMDR to someone who doesn't know? Especially I would imagine as a parent of 2 little kids, if I came into a school and the school counselor therapist told me that this would be helpful, how do you describe that to someone who has never heard of it before?
Yeah, it's tricky because, when we look at mechanisms of change and the impact on the brain and the neurology, that gets a little complicated. So, how I explain it is if we go through a traumatic experience, right, that stuff gets stuck.
Yep.
It can get stuck in our brains. And our brains are amazing. They'll do all kinds of things to protect us.
Yeah.
And sometimes they kind of overshoot it a little bit. In fact, here I go with a tangent, but I worked with a woman she was in her 70s when I first worked with her, and she had lived her whole life thinking, I had this wonderful childhood, everything was great.
Yeah.
And her brain had repressed all of these really traumatic, awful experiences that she had as a child.
She just didn't remember them at all.
Blocked them all out.
Okay.
But they're in there.
Right.
We're walking DVRs. It's all in there.
Yeah.
It's whether they get accessed or not. And one day she was washing the dishes and looking out the window and something triggered it. And all of these memories came back. Something opened it up.
In her 70s, this happened?
In her 70s.
Okay.
And it led to heart embolism, all of this, these somatic.
Physical.
Yeah. It was truly. So our brains are really amazing in how they store information. And so, it would be one thing, I guess, if, let's say, here I go with a hypothetical. Let's say I had a really bad childhood.
Okay.
I didn't, for the record. It was wonderful. Thank you, Mom and Dad. But let's say my dad was abusive.
Yeah.
And when I get triggered or I think about it, this image pops up of maybe him hitting me in the garage. So anytime I get triggered, boom.
You see that.
I see that. Yeah. That would be one thing. But it's not just that. It's all the emotions and the cognitions that are attached to that. So maybe when I get triggered, I have this image and I feel I'm unlovable. I deserve to be hit. All of this narrative.
Scared, and you sort of puts you in that moment, basically, right? Yes. It brings you back into it.
And I have this physiological response. I'm in fight or flight.
Yeah.
And that gets lodged in there. And so I think EMDR, the way I explain it to people is we can't delete that memory.
Right.
But what we can do is help your brain reprocess it. It's never going to be rainbows and unicorns. If this really happened to me, that's part of my story. But what we can do is maybe change some of those thoughts and reactions, automatic reactions that are associated with that to something a bit healthier, like I'm a survivor.
Yeah.
I am lovable, so that it's a healthier way for your brain to process it.
And so I have a friend who describes it as you get snagged, the memory snags you and you kind of can't move from there. And so you need help in that snag, figuring out how to untangle it. And so, or otherwise you just keep you'll be going down the road and it could be 5 years, 10 years, something happens and you get snagged again and it's the same thing over and over, right?
Yes, that's a great way of explaining it. We get snagged, we get stuck, and this stuff does, and that's the challenge with triggers, right? Is that, if there's an obvious trigger, I know if I go to Walmart or Target or something at rush hour, I'm going to have a panic attack.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to go.
Right.
I'm going to avoid that, which, again, therapeutically isn't the best way of doing it. But triggers in general can be a smell, a sound, a thought, so we can't plan for them. And they pop up and boom, now I'm back in this state that I thought I dealt with. So helping people to reprocess it in a healthy way is my goal as a trauma therapist.
And so back to the definition of how the EMDR therapy itself helps in those traumatic situations. How would you describe that?
So part of EMDR is this desensitization. And I think every evidence-based model of trauma treatment, engages some aspect of exposure. Mm-hmm. Right? We're going to have to go back and think about this, and it's going to be unpleasant. Mm-hmm. But if we do go back and we can touch it a little bit, then the next time we do it, we can maybe touch it a little bit longer to the point when, it doesn't have the teeth that it once had.
Yep.
And as we desensitize that experience, then we can start the installation phase of, here's the healthier way of processing this, in installing some of these cognitions and associated emotions with it.
I want to go back just a second to talk a little more about this sort of idea of trauma, right? And we often have this, conception of trauma being a very specific isolated incident, right? Or like there was a specific moment, but it doesn't have to be quite that acute, right? There's sort of like what they call uppercase T or lowercase t trauma. And as you were describing, the way that these emotions get embedded, my brain goes back to early 2020 COVID, right? Where we had all these students in a school and then suddenly it was shut down. Mm-hmm. And what does an experience like that do when it's lodged in the brain and we're not recalling it consciously, but instead we have this ongoing fear of everything could stop at any given moment, or nothing is permanent here, nothing is stable here. And now I'm back in the school environment and this is going to be plaguing me my entire, unless it's addressed, it's going to plague the rest of my educational experience.
Right.
So how do we think about trauma, this word trauma, and what happens, when these things are embedded and we're not consciously recalling them? What are the effects that people see in their lives?
Yeah, great question and great points about COVID and the change, and I think we still don't know the impact. Yeah. The long-term impact. I've got kids that are 9 and 13 and 17, and I look at my 9-year-old and what chunk of his life was COVID, where he had to,
super formative, right? Yeah,
right. When your brain is like putty, and things get internalized and locked in, and they're really challenging to unlock. Especially on our own without therapeutic intervention, they're really tricky because more often than not we get in our own way.
Yep.
And sometimes I think if my brain would just shut off, it would heal itself. If I didn't intentionally try and think about it this way, then it would probably be fine, relatively speaking. Trauma, I think, is, it's a word that it's good and bad that it's becoming, this consciousness of what trauma is. And sometimes it gets abused. It's like, oh, I got a C on my exam. Oh, that was traumatic. Well, it was probably stressful. But it does speak to the point of like trauma does not equal PTSD. Yeah. Right. It's a continuum, and it's completely personal and subjective, and a lot of times out of our control. Most times out of our control, how we process an experience. You and I might go through the exact same experience, and my brain processes this in a way that I feel unsafe, and I completely decompensate. And you might just move on from it and be like, "Wow, that was a bummer, but I'm fine."
Right.
And that's no fault of mine. It's just how my brain made sense of that. So I think understanding that there is this continuum as far as trauma goes, and it doesn't have to be a single event PTSD. Yeah. Although, from a treatment standpoint, EMDR and single event trauma are a little bit easier to target. When it gets complex, that's when there's multiple events, it's a little more challenging, still effective, but I'm not exactly sure if I answered your question there. I was just sort of spitballing.
That's perfect. I think we also, like you're saying, we kind of we don't know what we don't know, sort of. As a parent, so I have a almost 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and obviously I had a COVID baby, so she, it was great. Everybody was just home. My toddler was a little bit more, she remembered school. We pulled, she went one day and the next day she just didn't go back again for a year. So we had to like play school a lot and we had to like process. And so it's interesting hearing you talk about this because it was like the way her brain understood that, like she needed to play that like every day. Like she was like, this routine was sort of missing. But then there's so many kids who just were pulled out in those, like when they're reading and when they were first making friends and doing, and all of these. And I am, even though I think it's probably overused, it is nice that there's language for things like trauma now that people just, I'd rather be overused than underused because people are talking about it. It's like the generation of, we've all gone to therapy or almost everyone I know has gone to some sort of therapy.
Yep. It's so, it's so much more destigmatized, which is a wonderful thing.
Yep.
And I in no way am trying to minimize someone's experience.
Oh, for sure.
I'm much less interested in the verbiage, whether it meets the criteria for PTSD. I'm more interested in how did your brain process that experience? Yeah. That's relevant, and it's not for me to say, well, that's big T or that's little t or that's this or that. No, here's how your brain made sense of that. Let's help your brain heal. Let's reprocess it in a way that, just thinking about the COVID thing in your children and gosh, the impacts of that, I think about kids, and other than, the basic needs, right? Like in love and kindness and all of that stuff as a parent. I think about what do kids need for their developing brains and consistency, predictability. I see it every time I go
into... And that was totally pulled away from them.
That's gone. Go into a classroom and right up there on the wall, it's all listed. 8:30, spelling, 9:15, recess. They know what's coming. And that helps your brain not have to worry about what, because if I'm the teacher and I say, all right, we've got a quiz sometime today. Yeah. What did that just do to everybody's anxiety level?
Right.
Versus if I know when that's coming, I can focus on what I need to focus on right now because that's later on.
Yeah.
And that was all pulled away.
And and then for all the parents and for everybody else too, right? Sure. It was like, when do we go back to work and when do we not, and what happens and when can you go to the grocery store? And
right. What a mess.
Yeah. We're seeing this like adolescent mental health crisis, really, which is like, these anxiety levels going through the roof. And I don't know, maybe there's an argument that some of that stability was found in social media when students were put back at home. They had to find stability somewhere, and these platforms became one of the places that they could find that sort of stability. But it's really interesting. I mean, it's the question that I have is how do we get past it? What are the tools that we can use to help undo some of this now at scale? So. What are the, I guess this kind of brings us back to your education and to what you're doing now in social work, but what are some of the techniques we're using at scale? What are some of the challenges that we face as a community in creating tools? It's a little leading towards Dharma, Doctor, but I just want to.
Well, I mean, we could go on and on about the mental health crisis and the lack of providers and the lack of access to services, and it's real. It is a crisis. So on that level, I think we're talking like systematic change,
right?
On an intervention level, and looking at what practices are effective. Looking at, well, how do you become an evidence-based practice? Just because I go publish something on this technique or intervention, does that make it evidence-based? No. Right. I mean, there's a lot of hogwash that's published, quite honestly. And one of the big challenges is from where I'm looking at it as an intervention researcher is translational science. Like, how do these become evidence-based? How do agencies and clinicians adopt these on a big scale? Implementation research is really, really essential, because the literature would say, how long does it take from bench to bedside? In other words, from the laboratory to actual practice. And the literature says on average about 19 years. years.
Which we don't really have that kind of time
Wow.
for this crisis, right?
19 years.
Yeah.
Think
Okay.
about that.
Yeah.
19 years. How much the world has changed in the last 19 years.
Right.
We don't have time for that. Like this needs to, people need access now. And I think, one of the things that's happening with this mental health crisis and the inability, these 6-week, maybe 6-month wait lists,
Right.
is people need to be able to have things that they can do themselves, more prevention oriented,
Yep.
more self-help type strategies. And, I can get on a soapbox about the whole Western medical model. We're wonderful at, if something's wrong, here's a Band-Aid.
Right.
You're feeling depressed, here's some Prozac. And I'm not minimizing those. Those are really effective. If I was going to have a heart attack right now, this is a wonderful place to do it. Knock wood, that's not going to happen. But we're very great at the reactive.
Right.
We're not so great with prevention and wellness promotion. And that's the stuff that I'm really interested in, is how do I, what strategies, if I can't see someone for 6 weeks, what are they going to do in the meantime? Because they're either, if they don't have resources to be able to work on themselves and do some of the therapeutic work themselves, then they're going to escalate and it's going to be a crisis by the time I do see them.
I think of it as like a funnel. Like there's so many people on the front end, but there's so many other touch points for mental health, right? Like it's so hard to find the doctor or the right solution or the referrals or, all the medical part of it and the healthcare part of it. But then you have like teachers who are seeing this every day, parents who are experiencing it, trying to find some sort of solution to help their kid, help themselves be better parents in this new world. Younger and younger and younger kids are, they're talking about suicide around 8 and 10, where it was like teenagers before, like language that didn't even exist for those little kids in those spaces. And so that's where I started getting involved with this too. My husband did EMDR therapy. He had, for lack of big T, trauma when he was a kid. And then I, he swears by EMDR. He did all the other kinds of therapy and felt like it was so helpful. But at the same time, it's, he still sees someone. He sees her once a month. He kind of looks forward to this one specific thing. And so when I brought like the prototype of the tabs home, gave them to my 5-year-old during a tantrum, it was like, this is something where, is this the solution? Is this thing's going to solve everything? No, but is it a tool that's right now that's so helpful? Yes. And I think that funnel is so big. We don't want people having nothing.
Right.
And I think also when you're in those, it's hard for someone in a crisis state it feels huge to take the next step to do something. And so I'd be interested to kind of hear your input on that.
As far as what specifically?
I think just in general of like just other tools, because like you're saying, like even if you have a practice, your client list, there's backlogs, just what kind of tools do you give people or from your experience in EMDR in the day-to-day stuff? Like what are the kind of things that sort of you pass on to the people that you're helping?
Well, I mean, we're sort of looking at it here with Dharma Doctor, right? I think, having things that people can, it's really case specific.
Yeah.
But I think some of the things that, the holistic things to help them just simply access a more resourceful state. Mm-hmm. Number one, to be able to be aware I'm having a reaction right now.
Yep.
And bringing that into the frontal lobe and being objective and creating some distance, some meta awareness about that. Then we can do something about it. And some of those tools, are like we were talking about, body scans and things to help get us more grounded in the moment. Again, maybe these are Band-Aids. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right.
We have Band-Aids for a reason. They're useful. Is it going to, completely heal my brain and I've reprocessed this trauma because I did a body scan? No.
But is it a tool that you maybe didn't have before?
Absolutely.
Right.
It feels good in the moment, and now maybe I can move on with my day.
Yeah.
So I think those are the sort of things. I'm big on, a lot of my research, and this might be tangential, but relates to wellness promotion. And looking at our wellness, you're not either well or not well.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. There's social wellness, emotional wellness, spiritual wellness, all of those components. And are you attending to those? And I don't ask people to, my physical wellness maybe isn't ideal right now. Well, that doesn't mean that tomorrow I'm going to start training for an Ironman.
Yeah.
But maybe I can go for a walk at lunch for 10 minutes. Those are the little things that are buffers, that self-care, that lifestyle-related things that we can help people access. That to me is about prevention.
Yeah.
You know? And there's so many ways to do that. And what we're learning about bilateral stimulation and hopefully we're going to do some research and facilitate some studies around that. But there's already research out there that supports that bilateral stimulation can be effective in stress management.
Yeah.
We know that stress doesn't do a whole lot of good for us,
We talked about this a little bit in the last one, but like bilateral is literally like why you feel better on a walk, right? It's like one side of your brain, or dancing or jumping, or, just there's so many different ways. And I think especially since you talked about being a PE teacher, like just moving your body and how that helps you work through those snags.
Yes. And again, the whole idea of mind-body connection, right? That for the longest time, in Western society, we've treated those as separate things.
Yep.
And all the research is, I mean, it's irrefutable that, the way I feel psychologically impacts me physically and vice versa. So I do feel like that, any sort of intervention that is going to help us access that and really facilitate that connection is going to have benefit.
Yeah.
You've used, I just know this because of our conversations, but you've used bilateral stimulation outside of EMDR practice with athletes. And I know, when we're using bilateral stimulation in EMDR, often it's about bringing up sort of these snags or this traumatic memory so that we can first engage with it and then bringing in that positive cognition. And we use bilateral stimulation in both times, right? It's used to help with the desensitization as well as the installation of a positive belief. But I was really interested to hear that you use it to help athletes, prepare for an upcoming event or, get the correct visualization. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and what you've done and what that protocol looks like?
Yeah, for sure. And again, this is, it's such an interesting, we were talking about our journeys and how, being a PE teacher initially sort of, and being into athletics, that's always been an interest area of mine. And so, specializing in athletic performance enhancement, things like that. And I have a soft spot for working with athletes because I think immediately we look at an athlete and be like, wow, look how healthy they are. Well, maybe physically they are, but we don't know what's going on beneath that. And they're under such pressure. And so I feel like they are really at risk a lot of times. And I'm not going to bore you with statistics around depression and anxiety, but it's higher than in the general population.
In athletes specifically?
In athletes,
okay.
Yeah. So I've always been really interested in supporting athletes, and particularly when I was, working in a university counseling center, I'd get a lot of referrals because I sort of had that, I was that guy, right? And there's, there's sports psychologists in every collegiate team and every professional organization because they want that edge, right? It's $1 billion industry, whatever edge is going to help performance. But to ask an athlete who is going through, a depressive state to go talk to their sports psychologist who's enmeshed with the coaching staff,
right?
That can be a challenge.
Not a safe space.
There's a barrier to entry. There's friction.
Yes. So being removed from that, a lot of times I would work with athletes who were dealing with the pressure or depression or, whatever was going on in their lives, and they didn't necessarily want to talk to the team psychologist. A lot of times it was around performance, and I think EMDR, I've used EMDR with athletes to reprocess, a quote unquote traumatic event that happened during their sport. And maybe that was choking at a big moment, or maybe
Yeah.
that was an injury, or whatever it is. And so I used EMDR in more of a traditional sense that way. I've also used it more focused on the installation phase of this. And I think, thinking about our optimal state and being in the zone and thinking about, all right, well, tell me about a time when you were in that flow state that Csikszentmihalyi coined that term, flow. And if we can bring that into the present, well, why can't we lock that in?
Yeah.
Why can't we make it more accessible, right? And so that's been a big part of the work with athletes is, all right, I really want to create a switch so that you can access that state much more quickly.
Whenever you need it or when,
Yes.
yeah. Okay.
And so it doesn't have to be about a traumatic experience that happened to them in the athletic arenas. It can be about, all right, well let's describe, let's analyze what it is. What are the ingredients that go into this flow state, the zone,
Right.
and then let's lock it in.
Can you explain to me how you what would it actually look like to sit down with that athlete and use EMDR therapy? For me to visualize, are you using
or bilateral stimulation?
Or bilateral, yeah, exactly.
To lock in.
Yeah.
How do you use bilateral stimulation?
Bilateral.
How do you use bilateral stimulation to lock in a state or lock in a positive belief or positive cognition? What's that sort of protocol, and what's that process like?
I'm sorry. Let's edit this
Just
part.
pause.
That's okay.
As far as locking it, I mean, it's really, we're talking about the installation phase, right? So if we have this image of me, running track and being in that flow state, and, there's the image, what are the emotions? What are the cognitions that are going on? That's where I want to use the bilateral stimulation to help lock those in, to help reinforce that state. Because it's not just the image, right? It's everything. It's sensory. So that's, and then there's the future template protocol where we're sort of looking at the future. All right, what do we want? How do we want this to look in my upcoming race?
Yeah.
So that's where I will pair the bilateral stimulation.
Okay.
When someone has accessed that. So I have them, and a big piece of this is, can we bring it into the room right now?
Yeah.
And, we know that with performance that it's the same neural pathways, whether I'm actually doing it or I'm seeing myself do it. Our brain's not really differentiating.
Okay.
As long as it's a skill like shooting a basket that I've done and I have a high level of confidence and competence in, my brain is going through the same neural pathways if I'm really doing it or if I'm visualizing doing it. So we can work with that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. That means I can sit here and see myself do it and get better at doing it if I'm in that state.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's some interesting research around all this. There's lots of research coming out around EMDR in athletes. Personally, that's sort of how I use it is most of the time looking at this optimal state.
Yeah. Have you gotten pushback on that, or do you feel like it's you're introducing it and people are excited to try it?
Oh
or
my gosh. So yeah, no, it's been really impactful.
Yeah.
One collegiate athlete had been, he peaked freshman year and I was working with him as a senior, and that's what we did. He'd been slumping. He had, his personal best was freshman year, and now it's been 3 years and he's never reached that pinnacle again. So we broke it down and talked about what was going on during that time, and really teased out what are the ingredients that for that emotional state. And we accessed it. He was able to bring it into the room. We locked it in with the bilateral stimulation, came back one more time to say, hey, thanks. I got a new personal best, and I think I'm good.
Best case scenario.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I'd like to pat myself on the back and think that was me, but
but you're providing the tools, right? That I don't think that traditionally someone would put those together in that sense,
and
right?
Kind of going back to what can people do for themselves? That's a skill set he now has.
Yeah.
Granted, he didn't have the bilateral stimulation.
We got to get this guy some tabs.
Yeah.
We need to get him some tabs because, he knows now he's, that's locked in. And to an extent, he can create a switch.
Yep.
But of course that's going to go away if it's not used.
Right.
Right. So the more he can use tabs and he can get into that state, the stronger that switch is going to be.
It's a really interesting use case because we talk about it so much and, you're snagged on the other side of things. And I told the story last time, but my daughter was having like big emotions as a 5-year-old and on the floor, just couldn't snap out of it. You can't talk to him at that state. And I just put her on the couch and put the tabs in her hand and she instantly was just so distracted by them that it just calmed her down. And so, I think on the flip side of it doesn't always have to be in those states of high emotion, but it's really neat. Throw them in every athlete's backpack. I want them in every kid's bag, before tests and before interviews or, there's so many ways that just a tool to help you calm down. I think that when we talk about just mental health in general is it does feel like no matter what it is, it's, people are like, oh, I meditate and it makes me feel better. Or, oh, whatever the thing is when you are feeling like you can barely get through your day, those things feel so hard, right? That feels like such a big hill to climb. And so the idea that Dharma Doctor, you can have these tabs and it can give you something right now. There's not a lot of things out there that can really help you instantly in that way.
Yes.
And instead of thinking about wellness on this continuum of not well to, wellness is not just not being not well.
Yeah.
There's a whole spectrum of performance and maybe reimagining wellness into being in that optimal state or thriving. And it's not necessarily that we have to be there all the time. In fact, we can't, we won't. And we have to be able to react to the environment, but using a tool to help us access that optimal emotional positioning, right? And visualizing and getting back to that, we can use things to assist us in that process.
Yeah, one of the things that I'll do a lot of times is, once we've separate from trauma treatment, if we're looking at this future template, right, where we're trying to install this ideal state for whatever performance or whatever it is, I'll use a little bit of heart rate variability and pair that. And it's, because that's a visual representation, right? In just using heart rate variability, we can sit here, hook ourselves up and, think about being in that zone and everything's just nice and smooth. And then just remember something stressful that happened to you. And what happens,
just from the memory.
Just from the memory of it, it's a visual representation. And then have people use the tabs and get into that state. That is profound.
Yeah.
Because then they're just like, whoa, that just remembering it, imagine being in that state all the time, all day long, or look how quickly I can get out of that state into more optimal. So I think pairing that, and I always like the visual because it's like, oh, it really is working. It's not placebo. This is, so
feel
I
it
think
and see it. Yeah.
Yeah. And, we're critics and cynics and, I want proof, and we've seen that with mindfulness, right? Everyone's like, oh, mindfulness helps. Well, prove it.
Yeah.
And then we go to randomized controlled trials. Well, that's fine, but what's happening to the brain? Well, we need functional MRIs and, there's always, people want proof.
Yeah.
And
there's also a lot of almost snake oil in the wellness space,
yes.
We want proof, and then on the flip side, it seems, everybody can come out as a coach and everybody can come out as some sort of wellness practitioner who was trained with some unlicensed or some, particular vein of energy healing. And I'm not discounting those things. I've had positive experiences in a lot of them, but the massive proliferation of various modalities, it's sometimes difficult to find a true north. And EMDR's done a pretty good job of really validating itself as a evidence-based and effective protocol within the trauma space.
Yeah, and honestly, that's there's just so much information out there. It's hard to discern, what is a snake oil salesman or is this a legitimate credentialed coach, and I think the coaching industry in itself, that's one of the big challenges because anybody can call themselves a coach, and one of the things that I talk to my students about all the time is like, I don't expect you to come out of this program being, an expert researcher. What I want is people to be critical consumers of research and be able to look and say, well, because I don't know, I used to think, well, it's published, it must be legit.
Right.
There is some bad stuff published. I mean, early on in my career, I'm kind of like, ooh, do I have to include that on my CV? Because it's not rigorous, and I think EMDR has done a really nice, it's been around a long time now, and the research base is, is pretty amazing. And, in my opinion, it's hard to argue with the outcomes at this point. But there is a lot of stuff out there that, as far as like health and wellness promotion, that's like, well, how do I know this is legit?
Right.
Other than trial and error, or how do I know this researcher or coach is legit? It's a challenge.
Well, and so we talked about the tabs. I think I always see them as like the gateway drug to mental health. Like it's a really easy way to get started because it's something you can do now. And then ideally it helps, there's so many use cases like that you've even talked about, right? Like to use the tabs, you can use them by yourself or you can use them with a practitioner or it might just lead you into learning how meditation helps you feel better and all the different things. And so I think that is something that even what we're doing right now, we're trying to sort of evaluate does learning more about it make you feel more comfortable in using it and do podcast work. And so one of the things is using like body scans and some of the techniques that you talked about. Can you kind of talk us through like how you mentioned body scan, like tell us first what is that and like how does that kind of fit into this?
Yeah, again, we're going back to the mind-body connection, right? And we know that when your body is in a relaxed state, we're moving out of the limbic system and into the frontal cortex where we want to be, right? And it's almost like nature's cruel joke because, when do we need to be thinking the most rationally and clearly? Right. When I'm in a crisis.
And that's when you can't.
And that's when our limbic systems are on fire, right? So I think things like a body scan and simply, there's progressive muscle relaxation, which is a version of that. Scanning through your body and just being aware from the top of your head to your toes, going through each muscle group. And you can relax, you can focus on relaxation for those muscle groups. You can tense them up and then relax, or you can just, mentally scan through and notice any areas where you're holding on to tension and focus on those and relaxing those. What that's really doing is moving us in our brain into the present, so you're aware of what's happening in your body and letting go some of that that stress response, right? That fight or flight that happens and it takes hold of us, and because it's wonderful, fight or flight freeze response is super helpful.
But sometimes you just stay in it for too long and you don't even notice that after the stress is over.
Oh, it lingers.
How tight you keep your body or how you hold your jaw or all those things. And so,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
go ahead.
No. I was going to say, I've had some incredible experiences where you realize, your parts of your body become numb, right? Like you just lose that connection to various areas. And it's kind of like, the way that the memory, you forget or your brain protects you.
Yep.
In that same way, you lose that connection to a particular part of your body. And only by reestablishing that mental link, when we do that, we also reestablish the feeling and the sensation, and maybe it has that connection to a particular memory. That these things are not separate. That our relationship to our body and our relationship to the feelings and these connections mirror to some extent some of the psychological relationships and connections that we have or don't have access to.
Yes, absolutely. And the Body Keeps the Score. That book. I mean, we've all
classic.
I mean. Really,
just the title alone is like it just sums it up in such a great way.
And that mind-body thing is real.
Yeah,
and we have so much more control over it than we realize if we're conscious.
Yep.
A lot of this stuff is happening unconsciously, and that's again, with the best intentions, your brain is trying to protect you.
Right.
And it would be one thing if, there's a bear chasing me and I'm in fight or flight mode, but I'm in traffic.
Right.
I don't really need that intense response right now.
Yep.
So having strategies to be able to bring yourself back into a more resourceful state is really, really accessible and useful.
I just think we live in such an overstimulating world in general that so often our brain is just pushing through to the next, and you sort of just forget that you're even in your body, right?
Right.
I mean, I feel like working remotely and, there's like social media and there's all these things coming at you that feel like they're just so cerebral and that I don't even sometimes remember, like, I'm standing here doing these things anymore. And so it's so important. Like, I hardly ever take time to just check in with my body.
Right.
Right. And when you do, it is pretty eye-opening. Like, where's that pain coming? Or maybe I just need a snack or some water, because you just sort of keep pushing through because your brain is doing all that work for you.
Right. Yeah. It's go, go, go. And part of it is our society of, drive through fast food and 6-minute abs, and we want it right now, and we got to go to the next thing. And taking that time and having the accessibility of things like, if I've got these tabs and I can use them anytime I want during the day, fantastic.
Pause your body, like really just like take a beat for a second.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, the bilateral stimulation piece, there's evidence for the stress reduction, qualities of that. And really it's having us focus on our body, and it's doing the bilateral piece.
Yep.
Is that going to like open up a trauma window or something? No, no, that's a completely different protocol from EMDR. And I think, people sometimes link those together, that they have to be, one means the other.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be there. Bilateral stimulation is a component of EMDR, but on its own, it can have therapeutic benefit without having to target a specific memory or a specific traumatic experience.
Yeah, I think there's so many different use cases, and that's why this is such a neat product in general, is because I feel like it is the thing that helps you. It's like journaling, right? Or whatever it is, whatever you need is the modality to get you to that place where you're checking back in and slowing back down. We can all use.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think that, like you said, anything, whatever it is. And I feel like as a clinician and a researcher, it's my job to be critically looking at things that are accessible.
I want to circle back just for 1 second to the discussion we were having about this mind-body connection, and societally, we feel like we're moving into a space where it's more and more difficult. I was just at a conference this weekend, and one of the big topics was AI, and we were looking at these moments of revolution that occurred throughout society, and the Industrial Revolution, and eventually the creation of the knowledge worker, and eventually this creation of now what we're going to be sort of like an AI director. But what struck me was that with each of these societal evolutions, we became further and further removed from the physical and deeper into the cognitive, right? As we became knowledge workers, the asset became, the facts in our brain space. And now it's moving even further where, our biggest asset is the ability to direct this other intelligence and to create, some sort of directive. But the externality, the negative impact of that is that we lose the physical connection, to our bodies. So we're going to need some sort of way of augmenting that as the economy continues to grow in that direction.
That's fascinating.
The more powerful we get with AI, the more
terrifying is another way to describe that.
We lose grounding in order to make that work.
Yeah, the whole thought of like only being well in one domain, to me, is just absurd, because it's not. You can't really separate those. Having a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
You got in late. I know when I haven't slept well, all those words are on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah.
And I'm just not cognitively sharp. What's that from? My body is not rested.
Yep.
It's not in an optimal state. So it impacts my cognitive. So we can't just completely focus on one area and neglect, particularly with the body. So I do see that being being challenging moving forward. And how do we get people to be more grounded and be here, be here now, not to get all zen, but to stay present.
Well, and it's interesting too, because we talked about in athletes, like you sort of see an athlete, you see someone on social media, and I think especially with young kids who you're saying, like, especially during the pandemic, and we're seeking connection, right? But again, you see like one side of what a quote unquote healthy person is, whether it's like physically beautiful, an athletic person, someone who's very intelligent, but you sort of miss that whole picture. And I think generally speaking, we're seeing that's why rates of depression and isolation and feeling lonely are so high, is because we focused on these singular parts of humanity to some extent and missed out on the rest. And we're starting to feel like that leaves you feeling like huge parts are missing.
Yes.
Connection's such a complicated piece too, because we can be in a crowded room and still feel totally alone. Where it's not necessarily the fact that we were isolated via COVID. Like there's a huge psychological component, and this trauma or these feelings, these sensations, as they build up, they are by their own nature isolating. You become more obsessed or more aware of the discomfort of that thing that's on your brain or in your body that needs to get changed, and it prevents you from being able to be open and vulnerable and even present or aware of the people around you.
Yep.
So it's in order to get to connection, we first have to reduce some of these internal barriers and these internal factors that are really driving the disconnect.
Right. Yeah, I think that was well spoken. And there again, from a theoretical or a therapeutic perspective, that's sort of foundational, right? Is that if I've had this bad experience, and I've got intrusive thoughts as a result of that, and I can't stop them.
Yep.
And they're just, I'm sure we've all had that experience where you lay down at night, you're exhausted, you're like, finally my head hits the pillow, and then it's like someone hit a switch.
Yep.
And I can't shut my thoughts off. If you're experiencing that all day, what does that do to your mood?
Right.
Of course I'm going to feel horrible. And now, when I'm feeling bad, I want to just crawl into my cave.
Yep.
I don't want to deal with other people. And now I've just reinforced, well, I'm all alone. Now those thoughts, I knew it.
Right. You prove them to yourself almost. Right.
And now I'm spinning. Now I'm in that cycle. And what's the best place to disrupt that cycle? And, of course I'm like, well, go to therapy, but maybe that's not accessible.
Yeah.
So what can someone do right now to help them disrupt that cycle and maybe seek some connection or maybe get more into their body and feel grounded? And that's where I think Dharma Doctor can offer some support.
Well, the tabs while you're trying to fall asleep, right? Give your brain something else to focus on than this just like story that you've told yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The list for me as a mom, I'm just like the constant list where I'm just like, I'm not accomplishing anything, right? By doing this, I'm just spending all my brain space on it.
Yeah.
Go, keep going.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great example. Use them when you're falling.
Yep.
Like that's the beauty of these, is that you've got them with you. And it's not, and I would say definitely don't just use them when you are in a crisis or, because we need to train your brain, right? That, it's going to have a therapeutic effect, but the better you get at it, the easier it's going to be to access that state.
Which is a really good point, because I always think of them as using them as like to calm yourself down, but it might be the opposite, right? Like I'm in a good space, so like let's take a minute and see what this feels like so I can bring myself back here. I think that's the part that I definitely forget about.
Reinforce that. I mean, anytime I introduce, whether it's bilateral stimulation or any sort of, self-help type intervention, meditation, whatever, and, I'll talk about it with a client and, okay, I'm going to practice this. And the next time I check in, how'd it go? Yeah. Well, I tried it and it didn't work. Well, tell me, when did you try that? Yeah. Well, I was in a fight with my boyfriend and I was really upset. Well, Right.
Yeah.
The time to really get used to this and train your brain so that your brain knows to access this state and facilitates that process is when things are nice and calm.
Yeah.
I think there's, of course, it's helpful in these stressful situations, but to really make it accessible during those stressful situations, practicing it when you're in a good space is really going to make that better.
I had a friend her and her partner had done some marriage counseling, and her big takeaway was you have to bank good times, right? Like when things are bad, you have to like put enough, you have to just like notice the small things to bank enough of them to where you like remember that there's like good. And it's kind of the same thing, right? You only focus on using these things when stress is happening, but it's like bank the good times because that's how you remember like there's light at the end.
Right.
I'm going to take us back again. I have a bad habit of doing this, but I'm thinking slowly. There's, in the feedback loop you described of belief, these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies, there's a similar sort of trap that people get trapped in therapy too, which is this bad thing happened to me. I'm going to a talk therapist. I talk about it. I am still stuck in this. I am the way I am because this thing happened, and I'm, going to be that way. And I see this loop, and I think this actually takes us back to the very beginning, which was like sometimes we're just better off if we could just turn off our brains for a second. Yeah. And for me, one of the differentiating factors in EMDR is that it breaks that loop by attempting to, the physicality of the tabs or the physicality of bilateral stimulation actually pulls us out of the cognition and brings us to a place where it's not a problem, it's not a problem, it's just not there. It ceases to be on the brain. And I'd like to hear a little more about your experience working with clients using EMDR. I mean, the athlete who came back one more time to say thank you is a perfect example, but how bilateral stimulation or how somatic therapy has differed from talk therapy, and have you seen these sort of like conclusions, right, where people no longer need ongoing support rather than this sort of perpetual cycle of ongoing intervention and ongoing therapy?
Yeah, certainly. Absolutely. And I think you're right. I think that bilateral piece is bringing us into the body and thereby disrupting where I'm just spinning in the limbic system. Well, if I can get out of there, wonderful, and it doesn't have to be. And then, with the EMDR protocol, we can reprocess things in a healthy way and disrupt it that way. But even if it's not a big T trauma, we can disrupt the flow of that and the pattern that your brain has gotten into because, we're animals, right? We're like Pavlov's dog. Our brains are trainable. And once they get into a cycle, it's hard. Something has to disrupt that.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the bilateral stimulation can come in and disrupt that process. And that's an opening, right? Once we've disrupted it, it's not enough just to disrupt it.
Yep.
We have to do something. It always begs the question, now what? Okay, well now we're going to process it in this healthy way and hopefully get your brain, cycling in a more healthy, positive way. And I think, the bilateral stimulation, in my opinion, is sort of the conduit for making that happen. That's the thing that's going to disrupt the current cycle or the spinning cycle that I'm in.
Well, and I think it all sounds easier than it is. And when you're really in it, to have something be that disruptor, because you might have gone a whole lifetime without anything to disrupt that. Like that creates the space to do whatever it is that you want to do next, right? To identify it, to find more help, to have a break for a minute from the constant brain game that you're in all the time. So,
and sometimes that's all I need.
Right.
And as a therapist, I'm like, well, we don't want to avoid, we want to lean into the discomfort. And and sometimes I just need a break from this. I just need my brain to stop. Give me 5 minutes. Great.
Yeah.
That can be, that can be enough to get me through until
right.
I'm going to
and just to provide the space to have the perspective on your own situation is something that I think is hard.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I don't know about you, but I am a world-class catastrophizer.
Yeah.
If left to my own devices, in my head, all these thoughts are intense and abstract and they're all over the place. It's not until I can slow down and have some of that awareness of what's actually happening there. And in order to do that, something's got to disrupt the process.
Well, this has been awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you so much for coming and chatting with us. Yeah.
Our TV got messed up at some point, so
That's
I've
okay.
been mildly distracted by these strange aliens. And
I'm sure
Pluto's.
they can cut the Dharma Doctor TV back in.
Yeah, we'll just have to photo edit it, right, Roberto? All right.
Thank you so much.
James, thank you so much
My
for coming
pleasure.
on and for all this. This was an incredible conversation.
Yeah, this
super,
was a
super
blast.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you.